Most people believe they are afraid of death. But if we slow down and look more carefully, something else begins to appear. It isn't death itself that frightens us, but the idea that something we call me might suddenly stop. Right now, as you listen to this, there is a quiet sense of continuity, a feeling that you have been here for a while, and that you will continue to be here a moment from now.
Death threatens that continuity. Not pain, not darkness, but interruption. In Buddhism, this fear is not judged, it is observed. Because when we examine it closely, we begin to notice something unsettling. Every night, deep sleep comes, and for hours there is no story, no identity, no memory of you.
Yet you don't panic before falling asleep. Every moment of your life, thoughts vanish, emotions fade, versions of yourself quietly disappear. The person you were 10 years ago does not exist anymore. Neither does the version of you from last year, or even yesterday. And yet, here you are. So what exactly is it that we're afraid of losing in this quiet space we call miraculous Buddhism? We don't rush to answer that question. We stay with it because Buddhism does not begin with beliefs about death. It begins with attention to impermanence, attention to change, attention to the fact that things are already passing without destroying us. From this perspective,
death is not the opposite of life. It is not a dramatic failure at the end of the story. It is simply the most visible moment of something that has been happening all along. The problem is not death. The problem is our habit of holding on to identity, holding on to continuity, holding on to the idea that there must be someone permanent behind the experience. Buddhism doesn't ask you to reject that feeling. It asks you to look at it honestly. And if you're willing to do that, something unexpected begins to happen. The fear softens, not because death becomes less mysterious, but because the idea of a solid, unchanging self begins to loosen. In the sections that follow, we won't be talking about heaven or hell. We won't be making promises about what comes after. Instead, we'll explore how Buddhism understands death by first understanding life as a flow, as a process, as something already letting go, moment by moment. And from there, the question of death begins to change. If death is something that happens to everyone, why does the fear of it feel so personal? Why does it feel like your problem, your ending, your loss, from a Buddhist perspective? This fear doesn't come from death itself. It comes from identification, the habit of taking a temporary process and calling it me. Over time, we collect memories, preferences, roles, and stories, and they slowly weave together into a sense of self. Not a solid thing, but a convincing one. The mind says, "This is who I am," and then it tries to protect that image. Death threatens the image, not the experience. Because experience is already changing, already dissolving, already renewing itself, moment by moment. The image, however, wants continuity. It wants a future. It wants assurance that it will still be there tomorrow. This is why the fear feels intimate. It's not abstract. It's not philosophical. It feels like you are being erased, even though no one can clearly point to what that you actually is. In Buddhism, this is not considered a mistake. It's considered a habit, a deeply conditioned pattern of perception. And like all habits, it feels real until it's examined. When you look closely, the self you're protecting is never found as a single thing. It appears as thoughts, sensations, emotions, and reactions, all arising and passing. Yet, the mind links them together and calls the movement someone. This linking is subtle. It happens so fast that we mistake the process for an entity, and once that entity feels real, the fear of losing it feels unavoidable. This is why Buddhist teachings about death always begin with life. Not with what happens later, but with what is happening now. Because if the self is already fluid, already changing, already ungraspable, then death is no longer an intrusion, it's a continuation. On miraculous Buddhism, this is where we slow down. Not to dismantle the self aggressively, but to notice how gently it is already dissolving. How often we let go without realizing it. How many endings we survive every single day. The fear of death begins to shift when we see that nothing solid is being taken away. Something is changing as it always has. And when that is seen clearly, the fear stops feeling like a personal attack. It becomes a signal, an invitation to look more carefully. And that careful looking is where the Buddhist understanding of death truly begins. Most traditions try to answer the question of death. They offer images, destinations, rewards, or punishments. Something the mind can hold on to when uncertainty feels unbearable. Buddhism takes a different approach. Instead of answering the question, it gently turns it around. It asks whether the mind asking about death is actually seeing clearly. Because every answer about what comes after is built on an assumption that there is a solid someone who goes somewhere. When Buddhism looks for that someone, it doesn't find an owner of experience. It finds experience itself, sensations arising, thoughts forming and fading, awareness shifting moment by moment. No center, no fixed point, just movement. From this view, death is not a mystery waiting for an explanation. It is a question meant to expose how tightly we cling to certainty. The discomfort doesn't come from not knowing what happens after. It comes from realizing that the one who wants to know cannot be pinned down. This is why Buddhist teachings often remain deliberately quiet about the afterlife. Not because there is nothing to say, but because saying too much would reinforce the very attachment that creates fear. The mind wants closure. Buddhism offers clarity instead. On miraculous Buddhism, we approach death in this same way, not as a problem to solve, but as a mirror. A mirror that reflects how the mind grasps, how it resists change, how it reaches for permanence in a world that never stops moving. When death is treated as a question rather than an answer, something subtle shifts. Curiosity replaces panic. Observation replaces speculation. The urgency to know fades, and in its place comes a willingness to stay present with uncertainty. This doesn't remove fear instantly, but it changes our relationship to it. Fear is no longer something to escape. It becomes something to understand. And understanding in Buddhism is never intellectual alone. It is experiential. As we continue, we'll begin to see how this way of relating to death reshapes everything: how we live, how we attach, and how we let go. Not someday, not at the end, but right now, in the middle of ordinary life. In Buddhism, impermanence is often misunderstood as a philosophy and idea you're supposed to agree with. But it was never meant to be believed. It was meant to be noticed. Everything you experience is already demonstrating impermanence. Not in dramatic ways, but quietly. Sensations shift, moods change, attention drifts. Even the sense of being here is never quite the same from one moment to the next. The problem isn't that things end. The problem is that we keep expecting them not to. When Buddhism speaks about death, it begins here, not at the final breath, but in the ordinary, moment-to-moment fading that we usually ignore. Because once impermanence is seen clearly in daily life, death loses its role as a sudden intruder. It becomes familiar. This familiarity doesn't make life dull. It makes it honest. When we stop pretending that stability is guaranteed, we start relating to experience more directly. Less negotiation, less resistance, more presence. On Miraculous Buddhism, we often return to this point, not because impermanence is depressing, but because it's liberating. If nothing can be held forever, then nothing has to be held so tightly. Fear of death grows in the space between reality and expectation. Reality is change. Expectation is permanence. Impermanence simply closes that gap. This is why Buddhist reflections on death don't encourage morbid thinking. They encourage accuracy, seeing things as they are, rather than as we wish them to be. Once impermanence is no longer theoretical, the mind begins to relax. It stops arguing with time, and when that argument ends, death no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a continuation of truth. If the mind could accept uncertainty, fear of death would lose much of its power. But the human mind is not built for uncertainty. It is built to predict, to stabilize, to create a sense of ground where none is guaranteed. This is why questions about death so quickly turn into stories. Stories about what happens after. Stories about where we go. Stories about who we will still be. It is so. These stories are not foolish. They are attempts to soothe a nervous system that wants assurance. Buddhism doesn't criticize this impulse. It simply points out its cost. Every time the mind insists on certainty, it tightens around experience. It narrows awareness. It trades openness for control. And when control becomes the priority, fear becomes inevitable because nothing in life ever fully cooperates with control. Death represents the ultimate loss of prediction. No matter how intelligent or prepared we are, it remains an unknown. This is why it activates such deep anxiety, not because it is cruel, but because it refuses to be managed. In Buddhist practice, rather than replacing uncertainty with belief, we gradually build tolerance for not knowing. We learn to stay present even when answers don't arrive. This capacity to remain steady without closure is considered a form of wisdom. On Miraculous Buddhism, this is one of the quiet skills we return to again and again, not as a philosophy, but as a lived experience. Sitting with uncertainty until it no longer feels like a threat. When uncertainty is allowed, fear changes shape. It becomes less urgent, less personal. The mind stops demanding guarantees and begins to relax into what is actually happening. This doesn't make death understandable. It makes it approachable. And in that approach, something important shifts. Life stops being a race towards security and starts becoming an exploration of presence. The need to know what comes after loosens its grip, replaced by a willingness to be here fully while we can. At this point, it's important to be clear about one thing. Buddhism is not trying to replace fear of death with a more comforting belief. It isn't offering a better story about what happens after. It's pointing in a different direction altogether. That direction is awareness. When Buddhist teachings speak about death, they are really inviting us to look more closely at how we experience being alive, how we cling to moments, how we resist endings, how quickly the mind turns change into a threat. From this view, death is not a special category of experience. It is simply the most complete expression of impermanence. And impermanence is already shaping every breath, every thought, every relationship. The problem is not that we don't understand death. The problem is that we rarely understand change. We move through life assuming continuity, assuming stability, assuming there is something solid underneath experience that will remain untouched. Buddhism gently challenges that assumption, not to unsettle us, but to free us. Because when we stop insisting that things must stay the same, we stop fighting reality. And when the fight ends, fear loses its fuel.
On Miraculous Buddhism, this is the deeper invitation behind conversations about death. Not to fixate on endings, but to become more intimate with transience. To see change not as a failure, but as the natural rhythm of existence. This doesn't make life feel less meaningful. It makes it more precise. Each moment becomes unrepeatable.
Each encounter becomes fragile in the best sense of the word. Not something to possess, but something to meet fully. As we move forward, the focus will gradually shift from the emotional roots of fear to the way Buddhism describes continuity, rebirth, and the moment of death itself. But everything that follows rests on this foundation: seeing clearly, letting go gently, and learning to stay present, even as things pass. This is where the Buddhist understanding of death truly begins. After spending some time with these reflections, something subtle may begin to happen. The question of death doesn't disappear, but it changes its tone. It no longer feels sharp or urgent. It becomes quieter, more spacious. This is not because we have answered it. It's because we have stopped demanding certainty from it. In Buddhism, this shift is essential. Before any discussion of rebirth, continuity, or the moment of dying itself, the mind must first learn how to rest with not knowing. Without that capacity, every teaching becomes just another idea to cling to. Fear of death thrives in a restless mind, a mind that keeps reaching forward, trying to secure the future before it arrives. But when the mind settles, even briefly, it begins to sense something different. A kind of stability that does not depend on permanence. This stability doesn't come from guarantees. It comes from presence. When you are fully present, the question, "What happens to me when I die?" loses some of its urgency. Not because it's unimportant, but because the sense of me feels less rigid.
Less like a thing that must be defended at all costs. On Miraculous Buddhism, this moment of settling is where we like to pause, not to conclude, but to allow space. Space for the listener to notice their own relationship with endings, their own assumptions about continuity, their own habits of holding on. Because from here on, the conversation deepens. We will begin to explore how Buddhism understands continuity without a permanent self, how actions, intentions, and mental patterns move forward even when identity does not, and how the moment of death is seen not as annihilation, but as transition within a larger flow. But none of that needs to be rushed. For now, it's enough to notice this when the mind stops fighting uncertainty. Fear loosens its grip, and in that loosening, a different way of relating to death becomes possible not through belief, but through understanding. With this foundation in place, we can move forward carefully, step by step, not toward answers, but toward clarity. When Buddhism speaks about impermanence, it is not presenting a worldview. It is describing a lived fact, something you can observe directly without adopting any belief system at all. Look closely at your own experience right now.
Sensations arise and fade. Thoughts appear and dissolve. Even attention itself moves, shifting from sound to feeling to memory without asking permission. Nothing stays fixed long enough to become solid. This is not philosophy, it is observation. And yet, most of the time, we live as if this isn't happening. We organize our lives around the assumption of continuity. We plan, identify, and attach as though things will remain stable long enough to be secured. Death threatens this assumption, not because it is violent, but because it exposes what has always been true, that nothing we experience is designed to stay.
From a Buddhist perspective, the fear of death doesn't arise because impermanence exists. It arises because impermanence is ignored. We spend so much energy pretending things will last that when they clearly don't, the shock feels unbearable. This is why Buddhist reflections on death begin with impermanence, not as an abstract teaching, but as a daily reality. If we learn to see change in ordinary moments, death loses its power to surprise us. Notice how easily we accept small endings. A conversation ends, a feeling passes, a day fades into night.
These transitions rarely frighten us. In fact, we rely on them. We rest because the day ends. We heal because emotions move. What we resist is not change itself, but the idea of losing control over it. Impermanence becomes frightening only when we insist that something identity, experience, or awareness must remain untouched by time. Buddhism gently questions that insistence. It doesn't demand that we abandon it. It simply asks us to look more honestly.
When impermanence is seen clearly, something unexpected happens. Life becomes more intimate, less abstract. Moments matter more, not because they are permanent, but because they are fleeting. This is the first shift Buddhism invites when approaching death. Not to think differently about dying, but to see living more accurately. To recognize that endings are not interruptions, but part of the rhythm that allows anything to appear at all. As we continue, this understanding will become essential, because once impermanence is no longer denied, we can begin to explore a deeper question. If nothing stays the same, what actually continues? That is where the Buddhist view of continuity begins. Once impermanence is seen clearly, a strange question arises. If everything is always changing, then what exactly is it that dies? We often imagine death as the destruction of something solid. A self, a core, a permanent center of experience. But Buddhism invites us to look carefully and ask whether such a thing can actually be found in the first place. When you search for this self, what appears, thoughts come and go, feelings shift, sensations arise and fade. Even the sense of being an observer changes depending on mood,
attention, and circumstance. There is experience, but no fixed owner behind it. This doesn't mean nothing exists. It means existence is dynamic. Process, not substance. From this perspective, death is not the collapse of a solid entity. It is the dissolution of a pattern made of habits, tendencies, memories, and conditions that were never static to begin with. This is why Buddhism speaks so carefully about death. If there is no permanent thing to destroy, then death cannot be annihilation in the way we usually imagine. Something changes, something continues, but nothing solid is lost.
Fear arises when we try to protect what was never stable. We cling to identity as though it were an object, something that could be preserved if we held it tightly enough. But identity is more like a current than a container. It flows, it reshapes, it never stops moving. On Miraculous Buddhism, this is an important turning point, not because it removes all fear, but because it reframes it. The question is no longer, will I survive death?
But what exactly have I been calling me? All this time, this shift matters. Because when we stop imagining the self as a thing, death stops appearing as destruction. It becomes transformation, not mystical, not symbolic, simply the natural continuation of change. As this understanding deepens, another question naturally follows. If there is no fixed self, and yet something continues, what is it that moves forward? That question leads directly into the Buddhist view of continuity, karma, and rebirth, not as belief, but as description.
Quote. And that is where we go next. If there is no permanent self, the next question becomes unavoidable. What, if anything, continues? Buddhism does not answer this by introducing a hidden soul or an eternal essence. Instead, it points to continuity in terms of causes and conditions. What continues is not a someone, but a momentum.
Every action, every intention, every mental habit leaves an imprint. Not in a mystical sense, but in the same way experience shapes experience. Patterns form, tendencies strengthen, directions emerge. This is what Buddhism calls karma. Karma is often misunderstood as reward and punishment, but that framing misses the point. Karma simply describes how actions shape future experience, not morally, but causally. What you repeat becomes easier to repeat. What you reinforce becomes more likely to arise. From this view, continuity is impersonal. It doesn't belong to a self. It flows through conditions.
Like a current moving through water, it has direction without having an owner. This is why Buddhist teachings on rebirth avoid the language of I and me. There is no traveler moving intact from one life to another. There is movement, but no fixed identity moving with it. A miraculous Buddhism, we approach this carefully, not as something you're asked to believe, but as a way of understanding how patterns already operate in your own life. You can see it in habits that persist, even when you try to change. In emotional reactions that arise before thought.
In tendencies that feel familiar without being chosen. Seen this way, rebirth is not an exotic idea. It is an extension of something you already know. Continuity without a center. Movement without a self. This doesn't answer every question about what happens after death. Buddhism never claims to, but it reframes the question in a crucial way. The focus shifts from what happens to me to what continues when conditions persist.
And with that shift, fear begins to lose its grip. Death is no longer the end of a story. It is the transition point in an ongoing process, one that was never owned by a single self to begin with. In the next section, we'll explore how this understanding of continuity is often misunderstood, and why Buddhism takes such care to avoid turning rebirth into another belief system. When people hear the word rebirth, many immediately think of reincarnation, a soul leaving one body and entering another. From a Buddhist perspective, this is a misunderstanding, but an understandable one. The mind naturally reaches for familiar frameworks, especially when faced with something as unsettling as death. Buddhism deliberately avoids describing rebirth as the journey of a self, not because it wants to be vague, but because doing so would reinforce the very attachment that creates fear. The idea of a traveler suggests ownership, a fixed identity moving through time, something that must be protected. Instead, rebirth is described through continuity of conditions, causes giving rise to effects, tendencies shaping future tendencies. This continuity does not require a permanent entity to carry it forward. A common metaphor used in Buddhist texts is that of one flame lighting another. The second flame exists because of the first,
but it is not the same flame. There is connection without identity, continuity without sameness. This distinction matters, because when rebirth is misunderstood as reincarnation, it becomes just another belief to cling to, a promise that I will continue. And clinging, even to comforting ideas, keeps fear alive. On Miraculous Buddhism, we return again and again to this point. Buddhism is not concerned with preserving identity. It is concerned with understanding process. Once that difference is seen, rebirth stops being an abstract theory and starts looking like something deeply familiar.
You can observe it within a single lifetime. Notice how a habit continues even when circumstances change, how certain emotional patterns feel as though they've been with you forever, even though you cannot locate their beginning. This is continuity in action. From this angle, rebirth is not about what happens after death alone. It is about how experience
Perpetuates itself right now. Death does not create this movement. It simply does not interrupt it. Understanding this helps clarify why Buddhism speaks so cautiously about the afterlife. Any description that encourages identification would miss the point. The purpose is not to secure a future self, but to loosen the grip on the idea of self altogether. In the next section, we'll look at how this view changes the way Buddhism understands the moment of death itself, not as a final judgment or an abrupt ending, but as a transition shaped by conditions already in motion. From the Buddhist point of view, death is not a single instant. It is a process, a gradual unwinding of conditions that have been held together for a time. This is why Buddhism places so much emphasis on the state of the mind, rather than on beliefs about what comes after. At the moment of death, what matters most is not what we think should happen, but what tendencies are already present. The habits of attention, the patterns of reaction, the momentum built over a lifetime. Nothing new is introduced at death. There is no sudden moral reckoning, no external judgment. What unfolds is simply the continuation of what has been cultivated. Calm leads toward calm. Confusion tends toward confusion. Clarity supports clarity. This may sound sobering, but it is also empowering, because it means that the moment of death is not isolated from life. It is shaped by how we live now. Every time we practice letting go, every time we meet discomfort without resistance, we are quietly preparing the ground. In Buddhism, this preparation is never about control. It is about familiarity, becoming familiar with impermanence, familiar with uncertainty, familiar with the feeling of release. When these experiences are no longer foreign, death loses much of its shock. On Miraculous Buddhism, we approach this gently, not to create anxiety about dying well, but to highlight something simple. The mind you are cultivating right now is the mind that will meet every transition, large or small. Seen this way, death is not an exception to life. It is the most complete expression of it. A moment where conditions shift dramatically, but not unpredictably. The causes are already in motion. This understanding also explains why Buddhism does not obsess over the exact details of what happens after death. Fixating on outcomes distracts from the only place influence actually exists, the present moment. As we continue, we'll begin to explore how this view of death reshapes fear itself, not by denying it, but by revealing where it comes from,
and how it gradually loosens when the mind learns to meet change without resistance. When death is seen as a transition shaped by conditions, fear begins to change its character. It doesn't disappear all at once, but it loses its sense of threat. It no longer feels like an enemy waiting in the future. It feels like a continuation of something already familiar. Most fear of death comes from the belief that it will do something to us, that it will take something away, interrupt something stable, or destroy something essential. But as we've seen, Buddhism questions each of these assumptions. There is no fixed self to be taken, no stable core to be destroyed, no permanent possession to be lost. What remains is change, the same change that has always been present. This doesn't make death comforting. Buddhism is not interested in comfort. It makes death intelligible. And when something is understood clearly, fear no longer has the same authority. It becomes a response, not a verdict. On Miraculous Buddhism, this is where many listeners notice a quiet shift. Not a dramatic realization, but a subtle easing. The question of death stops feeling urgent. It doesn't demand answers right away. It can be held gently, without panic. This shift has consequences for how we live. When death is no longer treated as a personal catastrophe waiting to happen, life becomes less defensive. We cling less, we rush less, we listen more closely. Moments are no longer treated as things to secure, but as experiences to meet fully. From a Buddhist perspective, this is the real transformation. Not gaining certainty about the afterlife, but losing the need for certainty altogether. When the mind stops demanding guarantees, it becomes more present, more flexible, more at ease with change. This concludes the foundation. We have looked at impermanence as lived experience, at the absence of a fixed self, and at continuity without identity. With this understanding in place, we can move forward. In the next chapter, we will explore what Buddhism does not teach about death and why letting go of certain ideas is just as important as understanding new ones. Before exploring what Buddhism says about death, it's important to clarify what it deliberately avoids saying. Many misunderstandings arise not from Buddhist teachings themselves, but from assumptions we bring into them. Buddhism does not present death as a final judgment. There is no external authority deciding where you go, no cosmic courtroom weighing your worth. This absence is intentional. Judgment reinforces identity, and identity is precisely what Buddhism invites us to examine. It also does not promise an eternal destination. No permanent heaven to escape into, no everlasting hell to fear. These ideas offer certainty, but at a cost. They encourage attachment to outcomes rather than understanding of causes. From a Buddhist perspective, certainty is not the solution to fear. It is often the source of it. Another common assumption is that Buddhism offers reassurance about personal survival, that you will continue in some recognizable form. But this, too, is something Buddhism carefully avoids. Not because continuation is denied, but because personal identity is never treated as a fixed entity that can be preserved. On Miraculous Buddhism, we return to this distinction often. Buddhism is not interested in comforting the self. It is interested in understanding experience. And sometimes understanding requires letting go of ideas that feel emotionally supportive but obscure clarity. This can feel unsettling at first. Without judgment, without guarantees, without promises of permanence, the mind feels exposed. But that exposure is also freeing. Fear loosens when it no longer has a story to attach itself to. By removing these familiar frameworks, Buddhism creates space for a different kind of inquiry. Not what will happen to me, but what is actually happening right now. Moment by moment, this shift is subtle, but powerful. When death is no longer framed as reward or punishment. It stops carrying moral drama. When it is no longer framed as
Personal annihilation. It stops feeling like a threat to identity. What remains is a process, neutral, lawful, shaped by conditions rather than destiny. In the sections that follow, we'll look more closely at why these avoided ideas are so persistent, and how releasing them can radically change our relationship with death, not by offering answers, but by removing confusion. For many people, the idea of a permanent soul feels essential. It promises continuity. It offers reassurance that something core will survive change, loss, and eventually death. Letting go of this idea can feel like letting go of meaning itself. Buddhism understands this attachment, but it does not support it. Not because the soul is denied out of skepticism, but because when examined closely, it cannot be found in experience. What we call the soul is usually a sense of continuity, a feeling that I am the same one who was here before. Buddhism doesn't argue against that feeling. It simply asks where it comes from. When attention turns inward, what appears are processes, not entities. Thoughts arise and vanish. Emotions shift. Sensations change. Even the sense of being an observer depends on conditions like focus, mood, and memory. There is experience but no permanent core standing apart from it. A permanent soul would have to remain unchanged while everything else changes. Yet nothing in lived experience fits that description. Everything that can be known is conditioned, and everything conditioned is impermanent.
On miraculous Buddhism, this is a crucial point. The absence of a permanent soul is not presented as a loss, but as a clarification. When we stop insisting on a fixed essence, we stop defending an idea that reality never supported. This doesn't mean there is no continuity. It means continuity does not require an unchanging owner.
Just as a river flows without being the same water from moment to moment, experience continues without a soul carrying it intact. The belief in a permanent soul often intensifies fear of death. If something essential must survive, then death becomes a threat to its existence. Buddhism dissolves that threat by questioning the premise. If nothing permanent was ever present, nothing permanent can be lost. This shift is subtle, but profound. Fear loosens, not because we gain a guarantee, but because we stop demanding one. Death no longer feels like the destruction of an essence. It feels like the unfolding of conditions lawful, impersonal, and continuous.
With this clarification in place, the major misconceptions fall away. Judgment, eternal destinations, permanent identity, none are needed to understand death through a Buddhist lens. In the next section, we will begin turning fully toward what Buddhism does, emphasize how understanding death transforms the way we live.
Relate and let go, here and now, when ideas of judgment, eternal destinations, and a permanent soul fall away. It can feel as though something essential has been taken from us. The mind is used to leaning on these structures. Without them, there is a moment of groundlessness. Buddhism does not rush to fill that space. Instead, it invites us to stay with it, to notice what remains when familiar explanations are set aside. What often remains is something surprisingly simple: experience itself, unfolding without commentary, without judgment. Moments are no longer weighed against an ultimate outcome. Without eternal destinations, life is no longer treated as a test.
Without a permanent soul to defend, identity becomes lighter, more flexible. This doesn't strip life of meaning. It shifts where meaning is found. Meaning moves from the future into the present, from what might happen later into what is happening now. Attention replaces belief. Clarity replaces reassurance.
On Miraculous Buddhism, this is where many listeners notice a subtle relief. Not because everything makes sense, but because fewer things need to. The mind stops carrying unnecessary explanations and begins to rest in direct experience. From a Buddhist perspective, this resting is not passive, it is awake. It allows us to meet life more honestly, without filtering everything through fear of death or hope for reward. When death is no longer framed as judgment, it stops pressuring life. When it is no longer framed as annihilation, it stops threatening identity. What remains is a natural process, one among many that does not need
to be dramatized. This is why Buddhism speaks about death in such understated terms. Not because it lacks depth, but because it refuses to inflate what does not need to be inflated. Simplicity is not avoidance. It is precision. With these misconceptions set aside, the ground is clear. We can now turn fully toward how understanding death reshapes the way we live, not theoretically, but practically. How it changes the way we relate to fear, attachment, and the present moment. That is where we go next. Fear of death does not appear suddenly. It is built slowly, over time, through habits of thought and attention that most of us never question. From a Buddhist perspective, this fear begins with misidentification. We mistake changing experience for a fixed self. And once that mistake feels real, anything that threatens change begins to feel dangerous. The mind learns early to create a center. A sense of me who remembers the past, anticipates the future, and tries to remain intact through time. This center feels natural, even necessary, but it is not observed directly. It is inferred. Once the center is assumed, fear follows automatically, because anything that ends experience appears to end the one who owns it. This is why fear of death feels different from other fears. It doesn't target a specific event. It targets existence itself. The mind imagines not just loss, but erasure. In Buddhism, this fear is understood as conditioned. It arises from repeated reinforcement of identity. Each time we say this is happening to me, the sense of self tightens. Each time we resist change, the fear of ending grows stronger. This process is subtle. It does not require trauma or belief. It unfolds naturally through everyday life. Planning, remembering, comparing, protecting. All of these activities strengthen the idea of a continuous self moving through time. Death becomes frightening, not because it is unknown, but because it contradicts the story the mind has been rehearsing all along. From this view, fear of death is not a flaw. It is a consequence, a predictable result of how attention has been trained. Understanding this is important because it shifts the question. Instead of asking how to remove fear, Buddhism asks how fear is maintained. What conditions keep it alive? What habits of perception feed it day after day? As we begin to see these habits clearly, fear starts to lose its inevitability. It is no longer something that happens to us. It becomes something that arises, and therefore something that can change. In the next section, we'll look more closely at one of the strongest conditions behind this fear, the way time is experienced, and how the mind turns future uncertainty into present anxiety. The fear of death is closely tied to how the mind experiences time. Not time as measured by clock, but time as imagined continuity, a line moving forward with me at its center. Most of the time, we live slightly ahead of the present. We anticipate, we project, we imagine what comes next and assume that the same me will arrive there intact. This assumption is rarely questioned, but it quietly shapes everything. When the future feels open and predictable,
this movement through time feels safe. But when the future includes an unavoidable unknown, the same movement becomes anxiety. The mind keeps moving forward, but it cannot see what it expects to see. Death represents a break in the timeline the mind relies on. It is not just the end of events, but the end of projection. And without projection, the sense of self begins to wobble. From a Buddhist perspective, this is where fear intensifies. Not because something bad is imagined, but because imagination itself reaches its limit. The future can no longer be populated with familiar reference points. The mind responds by tightening.
it tries harder to define identity, to secure meaning, to ensure continuity. Ironically, this effort amplifies fear. The more the mind insists on a guaranteed future, the more threatening uncertainty becomes. Buddhism approaches this differently. Rather than trying to repair the timeline, it invites attention back to the present moment.
Not as an escape, but as a correction. In direct experience, there is no future self to protect. There is only what is happening now. This shift does not deny time. It changes how time is held. The future is no longer treated as a possession that must be secured. It is allowed to remain open. When this openness is practiced, even briefly, fear changes its texture. It loses its sharpness. It becomes less personal. The imagined self moving through time relaxes, and with it, the urgency to know what comes next. As we continue, we'll explore how this change in relationship to time opens the door to a different way of meeting death, not as a future event of fear, but as part of the same process unfolding in every moment. One of the quiet ways fear of death grows stronger is through avoidance. Not dramatic avoidance, but subtle habits of turning away whenever the topic feels uncomfortable. We distract ourselves. We stay busy. We fill silence with noise. When thoughts about endings arise, we quickly replace them with plans, goals, or entertainment. This feels harmless and even healthy. But over time, it trains the mind to treat death as something unmanageable. Avoidance teaches fear that it is justified. From a Buddhist perspective, what we avoid gains power. Anything we refuse to look at becomes exaggerated in imagination. The unknown grows larger when it is kept at a distance. This is why death can feel overwhelming, even when it is rarely thought about directly. The mind has learned that it is not safe to stay with the idea. So when it does arise, the reaction is immediate tension. Buddhism approaches this pattern gently. It does not encourage fixation on death, nor does it promote morbid reflection. Instead, it invites familiarity, a willingness to stay present with discomfort without trying to solve it or escape it. When avoidance softens, fear begins to lose its intensity, not because answers appear, but because the nervous system learns that uncertainty can be tolerated, that nothing catastrophic happens when the mind remains open. This is a subtle but powerful shift. Fear thrives on resistance. When resistance eases, fear has less to push against. It becomes less solid, less convincing. In everyday life, this looks simple. Allowing a moment of silence. Letting an uncomfortable thought pass without replacing it. Staying with the feeling of not knowing just a little longer than usual. These small acts retrain attention. They weaken the habit of avoidance and replace it with curiosity. And curiosity, unlike fear, does not demand control.
As this capacity develops, the idea of death begins to feel less foreign, less like a threat outside of life, and more like something that belongs to the same landscape as everything else we experience. In the next section, we'll look at how this growing familiarity changes the way the mind relates to loss,
endings, and impermanence, not just at death, but throughout life. Long before death arrives, we encounter loss in many forms. Relationships end. Roles change. Abilities fade. Plans fall apart. These experiences are often treated as separate from death, but from a Buddhist perspective, they are closely related. Each loss is a small ending, a moment where something familiar no longer continues in the way we expected. And each time this happens, the mind reacts, sometimes with sadness, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with denial. What matters is not the loss itself,
but how it is met. When loss is resisted, it reinforces the idea that endings are threats. The mind learns that change equals danger, and death becomes the ultimate symbol of that danger. But when loss is allowed, felt fully, without immediately trying to fix or replace it, something different happens. The nervous system learns that endings can be survived. This learning is quiet. It doesn't come from thinking differently, but from experiencing directly that letting go does not destroy us. Each time a loss is met without collapse, the fear of death loosens a little. From a Buddhist point of view, daily losses are not failures, they are teachers. They show us how attachment forms and dissolves. They reveal where we cling and where release is possible. This does not mean loss becomes painless. Buddhism does not promise that. Pain may still arise. Grief may still move through the body. But pain is not the same as fear. Pain can be felt without imagining annihilation. When loss is seen this way, it stops accumulating into a single overwhelming fear. Instead of carrying every ending forward, the mind learns to complete them as they happen, to let them finish. This capacity to complete experience is essential. Without it, unfinished endings pile up, and death appears as the final, unbearable accumulation. With it, death is seen as another transition, significant, yes, but not foreign. As we continue, we'll explore how cultivating this ability to meet endings reshapes not only fear, but also how meaning is experienced in life. Because when endings are no longer denied, presence deepens. That is where the conversation turns next. Much of how we live is shaped by postponement. We delay presence, delay care, delay attention, assuming there will be time later. This habit is closely tied to fear of death, even when we're not aware of it. When death is pushed into the distance, life becomes provisional. Moments are treated as preparation for something else. Meaning is deferred. We live as though the real point of living has not yet arrived, from a Buddhist perspective. This postponement is subtle but costly. It keeps us slightly absent from our own lives, always leaning forward, waiting for a future that promises fulfillment, resolution, or safety. Fear of death feeds this pattern. As long as death is imagined as a future interruption, the present moment feels incomplete. Something is always missing. Something must still be secured. But when fear softens, this structure begins to change. Without the pressure to outrun death, meaning no longer needs to be postponed. It is no longer tied to outcomes, achievements, or guarantees. It becomes something that arises directly from presence. This does not make life smaller. It makes it more immediate. Attention deepens. Encounters feel less instrumental. Experiences are no longer evaluated solely by what they lead to. From a Buddhist view, This shift is essential. When death is no longer denied, life stops being a rehearsal. It becomes the event itself. This doesn't eliminate ambition or planning. It changes their tone. Plans are held more lightly. Ambitions are pursued without being asked to justify existence.
Success and failure lose some of their weight because meaning is no longer outsourced to the future. In this way, understanding death reshapes how we relate to time. The present moment is no longer something to get through on the way to something else. It becomes sufficient. As this sufficiency is tasted, even briefly, fear loses one of its strongest supports. The need to secure a future self weakens when the present is no longer experienced as lacking. In the next section, we'll look at how this shift toward presence affects compassion toward ourselves and others, and why Buddhism sees this as one of the most natural outcomes of understanding death clearly.
When fear of death no longer dominates attention, something unexpected begins to emerge. Compassion, not as a moral instruction, but as a natural response. As long as we are preoccupied with securing our own continuity, much of our energy is spent protecting identity. We defend our views. We guard our time. We measure interactions by what they give us. Fear narrows perception. But when death is understood more clearly, that narrowing begins to relax. We start to recognize that everyone is living under the same conditions. Everyone is changing. Everyone is losing. Everyone is moving through uncertainty without guarantees. This shared vulnerability becomes visible once we stop pretending we are exceptions. From a Buddhist perspective, compassion arises from this recognition, not from obligation, but from clarity. When the illusion of permanence softens, the boundaries between my suffering and your suffering become less rigid. This doesn't mean we lose individuality. It means individuality is no longer defended at all costs. We listen more carefully. We react less aggressively. We become more patient with confusion, our own and others. When life is no longer treated as a competition against time, other people stop feeling like obstacles. This is why Buddhism often links reflections on death with compassion. Not to induce sadness, but to dissolve isolation. Fear isolates. Understanding connects. When we see that nothing we cling to can ultimately be secured, clinging loses its justification. And when clinging loosens, generosity becomes easier. Not just generosity of resources, but generosity of attention and presence. This compassion is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a willingness to stay, to accompany others in uncertainty without trying to fix it, to recognize that impermanence is not a personal failure, but a shared condition. With this shift, fear of death no longer dominates the emotional landscape. It becomes one element among many, no longer the organizing principle of life. This completes the arc of this chapter. We have seen how fear of death is formed, reinforced, softened, and ultimately transformed. With this understanding in place, we are ready to move forward.
In the next chapter, we will turn towards something more practical, how Buddhism approaches preparing for death, not through ritual or belief, but through the way we live each day. Preparing for death by learning how to live in Buddhism. Preparing for death does not mean rehearsing the moment of dying. It means learning how to live without clinging. Because the way we meet death is shaped by the way we meet life. Again and again, in small, ordinary moments. Most of us think of preparation as something deliberate, a plan, a ritual, a set of instructions for the future.
But Buddhism approaches preparation indirectly. It looks at habits rather than events. How do we respond when things don't go our way? How do we meet discomfort, How quickly do we reach for distraction when something feels unstable? These questions matter more than any belief about death, because they reveal how the mind handles
change. And death, from a Buddhist perspective, is the most complete form of change. If we resist small changes, we will resist large ones. If we cling to minor comforts, we will cling at the end. If we cannot let go in daily life, letting go at death will feel foreign. This is why Buddhist practice places such emphasis on awareness in the present moment. Not to create calm, but to develop familiarity. Familiarity with sensations arising and passing. Familiarity with emotions coming and going. Familiarity with the fact that nothing stays exactly as it is. Preparation happens quietly when we notice these movements without interference, when a thought fades and we don't chase it, when a feeling passes and we don't immediately replace it, when a situation ends and we allow it to end. Each of these moments is a small rehearsal, not for dying, but for releasing control. This kind of preparation does not require faith. It requires attention, and attention, unlike belief, is always available. As this attention deepens, the idea of death begins to change. It is no longer imagined as an isolated event waiting in the future. It becomes part of a continuous process that we are already participating in. In the next section, we'll look more closely at one of the most important daily practices Buddhism emphasizes, learning to let go, not as an idea, but as a lived skill. Letting go is often misunderstood as something dramatic, a final release, a spiritual breakthrough. But in Buddhism, letting go is trained quietly, through ordinary moments that rarely feel significant. Each day offers countless opportunities to notice attachment, a preference not met, a plan interrupted, a feeling we want to hold on to, a thought we don't want to lose. These moments reveal how tightly the mind grips experience. Most of the time, this gripping happens automatically. We don't decide to cling. We simply do. And because it feels normal, we assume it is necessary. Buddhism questions that assumption. Letting go in this context does not mean pushing things away. It means allowing experience to complete itself without interference. When a sensation arises, it is allowed to arise. When it fades, it is allowed to fade. This sounds simple, but it runs counter to habit. The mind is trained to prolong pleasure and shorten discomfort. Letting go interrupts that pattern. It teaches the mind that it does not need to manage every experience to remain intact. This training matters because clinging is cumulative. Each time we tighten around experience, we strengthen the reflex to resist change. Over time, this reflex becomes fear. Fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, fear of endings. Daily letting go weakens that reflex. It does not eliminate desire or preference. It changes how they are held. Experiences are no longer treated as possessions. They are met, appreciated, and released. This is how letting go prepares the mind for death, not by rehearsing the final moment, but by reducing the shock of release. When release is familiar, it is no longer interpreted as danger. From a Buddhist perspective, this familiarity is a form of freedom. The mind learns it can remain open even as things pass. That openness is not indifference, it is clarity. As this clarity develops, the grip on continuity loosens. The need for experience to last weakens. And with that, fear begins to lose its urgency. In the next section, we'll explore how this practice of letting go affects the way we meet discomfort and pain, another essential aspect of preparing for death through living well.
One of the clearest ways to see how prepared we are for death is to notice how we meet discomfort. Not extreme pain, but the mild, everyday
discomforts we usually try to avoid. A difficult emotion, an awkward silence, a sensation we don't like, a moment of uncertainty. Most of the time, the response is automatic. We distract ourselves. We reach for something familiar. We try to replace discomfort with relief as quickly as possible. This habit feels protective, but it quietly trains the mind to believe that discomfort is dangerous. Buddhism offers a different training. Instead of escaping discomfort, we learn to stay, not to endure it forcefully and not to analyze it, but to feel it directly as it is. Sensation without commentary.
emotion without storyline, experience without resistance. This does not make discomfort pleasant, but it changes our relationship to it. When discomfort is met without escape, it reveals something important. It moves, it changes, it completes itself. The mind discovers that discomfort is not a fixed state and not a threat to its existence.
This discovery is essential because fear of death is often fear of an intense, uncontrollable experience. If we believe that discomfort will overwhelm us, then the idea of death becomes terrifying. But when we learn, through experience, that even difficult sensations can be met and allowed to pass, the nervous system relaxes. It no longer reacts to discomfort as an emergency. From a Buddhist perspective, this relaxation is not numbness, it is resilience. The ability to remain present without collapsing or fleeing. Each time discomfort is met this way, confidence grows quietly.
Not confidence in survival, but confidence in awareness. A trust that experience can be held without being owned or resisted. This trust matters deeply at the end of life, when sensations intensify or familiarity dissolves. The mind that has learned to stay present will not panic as easily. It recognizes the territory.
In this way, meeting discomfort in daily life becomes one of the most practical preparations for death. Not because it predicts what will happen, but because it trains how the mind responds when control is limited. In the next section, we'll explore how this capacity to stay present in discomfort naturally leads to a deeper sense of peace, not as an emotional state, but as a stable way of relating to change. Peace is often imagined as something that happens when everything is settled, when problems are solved, when uncertainty disappears. But from a Buddhist perspective, peace arises in a very different way.
It does not come from control, it comes from understanding. When we stop trying to manage every sensation, emotion, and outcome, a quieter stability begins to appear. Not because life becomes predictable, but because the mind is no longer fighting unpredictability. This kind of peace is not a mood. It doesn't depend on feeling good. It is a way of relating to experience that remains steady, even when conditions change. Daily practice reveals this slowly. When discomfort is allowed without resistance, the mind discovers it can remain present without tightening. When letting go becomes familiar, experience no longer needs to be secured to feel safe. This is why Buddhism does not define peace as the absence of difficulty. It defines peace as the absence of struggle with difficulty. Control creates tension because it is always provisional. Something must constantly be maintained. Something must not go wrong. When control is the foundation of peace, peace is fragile. Understanding changes that foundation. When we understand impermanence directly, we stop asking experience to remain the same. When we understand the absence of a fixed self, we stop defending identity at all costs. And when these expectations soften, peace becomes less conditional. This shift is essential when
Approaching death, at the end of life, control naturally diminishes. The body changes. Familiar reference points fall away. If peace depends on control, fear will dominate. But if peace rests on understanding, it remains accessible. This does not mean the end of life is effortless. Buddhism does not promise that. It means the mind does not have to add panic to difficulty. It can meet change without treating it as an emergency. Peace, in this sense, is a form of readiness. Not readiness for a specific event, but readiness for change itself. As we move forward, we'll explore how this readiness reshapes the final stages of life, not through prediction, but through the quality of attention that is brought to each moment. That is where the conversation turns next. As understanding deepens, preparation for death begins to look less like a future task and more like a way of living. Not a checklist, but a quality of attention that leaves fewer loose ends behind. Much of our fear around death comes from incompletion. Unfinished conversations, unexpressed care, emotions postponed, truths avoided. These unresolved pieces accumulate quietly, and the mind carries them forward as tension. Buddhism does not suggest resolving everything perfectly. Life rarely allows that. It suggests something more realistic, meeting experience as it happens. So less remains unresolved. When a feeling arises and is acknowledged, it does not linger in the same way. When care is expressed, when it is felt, it does not turn into regret. When attention is present, moments complete themselves. This completion is subtle, but powerful. It changes the texture of time. Instead of carrying the past forward unfinished, the mind learns to let moments end where they are. From a Buddhist perspective, this is one of the most practical forms of preparation. Not controlling outcomes, but reducing accumulation. Not fixing life, but meeting it fully enough that it does not need to be carried. This way of living does not eliminate loss or difficulty. It reduces the weight they leave behind. When experiences are allowed to complete, they don't pile up into a single overwhelming burden. At the end of life, this matters. The mind that has learned to complete moments is less likely to grasp for resolution that cannot be found. It recognizes the feeling of ending. It has met it many times before. This is not about being ready in a dramatic sense. It is about familiarity. Familiarity with saying yes to what is present and letting go of what has already passed. When life is lived this way, death no longer feels like an interruption demanding urgent closure. It feels like a continuation of a pattern that has already been practiced, meeting what arises and allowing it to end. This completes the focus of this chapter. We have seen how preparation for death in Buddhism is inseparable from how we live. Not through belief, but through attention, letting go, and the ability to meet change without resistance. In the next chapter, we will turn toward the final stage, how Buddhism understands the experience of dying itself, and what it means to meet that transition with clarity rather than fear. In Buddhism, dying is not understood as a single moment. It is seen as a gradual unfolding a process rather than an event. This perspective matters because it changes how fear is approached. When death is imagined as an instant cutoff, the mind reacts with shock. It braces for annihilation. But when death is understood as a sequence of changes, it becomes something that can be met step by step. Just as sleep does not arrive all at once, dying is described as a series of transitions. Familiar reference points loosen, the body's signals change, the sense of control diminishes. None of this is treated as abnormal. It is simply the continuation of impermanence.
What Buddhism emphasizes here is not the mechanics of the process, but the quality of awareness present during it. Awareness does not disappear immediately. It changes, and how it changes is influenced by familiarity. A mind that has practiced letting go will recognize this terrain. A mind that has learned to stay present without grasping will not panic as easily when things begin to fall away. This is why Buddhist teachings place so much importance on how one lives before death.
The habits formed over years do not vanish at the end. They shape how transitions are met. Fear intensifies when the mind expects stability. It softens when change is already familiar. In this way, dying is not a special challenge separate from life. It is the final expression of the same process we have been moving through all along.
Things arising, things fading, control loosening, awareness adapting. This view does not remove uncertainty. Buddhism does not claim to map every detail of dying. What it offers instead is orientation, a way of understanding that makes the process less alien.
As we continue, we will look more closely at what Buddhism emphasizes during this time, not beliefs to hold on to, but states of mind that support clarity and ease as familiar structures dissolve. In Buddhist understanding, what matters most during dying is not what someone believes, but how the mind is conditioned to respond. Belief is conceptual, habit is embodied, and in moments of transition, the mind falls back on what it knows most deeply. As familiar structures begin to loosen, the ability to think abstractly often weakens. Ideas about what should happen or what one hopes will happen lose their grip. What remains are tendencies, ways the mind has learned to meet experience. This is why Buddhist teachings emphasize calm, clarity, and non-grasping. Not as ideals, but as trained responses. A mind accustomed to agitation will agitate. A mind familiar with ease will move toward ease. This is not judgment. It is momentum. The state of mind at the end is not created in that moment. It is revealed. Every time we practice returning to the present, we strengthen familiarity with awareness. Every time we release a thought without following it, we weaken the habit of clinging. These small trainings accumulate quietly, shaping how the mind behaves when control is reduced. From this perspective, dying is not the time to introduce new strategies. It is the time when practice shows its effects, not perfectly, but reliably. The mind does what it has been trained to do. This understanding removes pressure. There is no requirement to think the right thoughts or hold the right beliefs at the end. What matters is not performance,
but conditioning. And conditioning is shaped long before the final transition. Fear arises when we imagine the end as a test we must pass. Buddhism reframes it as a continuation. The same attention, the same habits, the same relationship to experience now expressed under different conditions. This reframing is important. It shifts preparation away from future anxiety and back into daily life. Each moment of awareness becomes relevant. Pause. Each act of letting go becomes meaningful. As we continue, we'll explore how Buddhism understands the role of attachment during this stage and why releasing attachment, even gently and incompletely, can profoundly affect how the mind moves through the final transitions. As the process of dying unfolds, attachment becomes more visible, not because it suddenly appears, but because the usual ways of managing it begin to fall away. In everyday life, attachment is often hidden behind activity. We stay busy, we distract ourselves, we reinforce identity through roles and routines. But as these supports loosen,
Attachment reveals itself more clearly as a pull toward what is familiar and a resistance to what is changing. From a Buddhist perspective, attachment is not a moral failing. It is a habit of holding on to experiences, identities, and expectations as though they could provide stability. When those anchors weaken, the mind may respond with tension. This tension is not inevitable. It depends on familiarity. A mind that has practiced letting go, even imperfectly, recognizes the feeling of release. It has encountered it before when plans changed, when losses occurred, when control was limited. Because of this familiarity, attachment does not need to escalate into panic. Attachment at the end of life is often subtle. It may appear as longing for people, fear of separation, or a wish for things to remain as they are. Buddhism does not ask that these feelings disappear. It asks only that they are met with awareness rather than resistance. When attachment is met this way, it softens. It no longer needs to dominate attention. The mind learns that it can allow connection and release to coexist. This is an important point. Letting go does not mean cutting off care or affection. It means allowing care without demanding permanence. Relationships are not denied. They are held more gently. As attachment loosens, the mind becomes more spacious. Experience is less crowded by grasping. This spaciousness supports clarity, even as familiar reference points dissolve. From this view, the work of a lifetime is not to eliminate attachment, but to relate to it differently. To recognize it as a movement, not an identity, a tendency, not a command. As we move forward, we'll look at how this softening of attachment affects the transition itself, how the mind moves when it is no longer pulled as strongly in any one direction. As attachment softens, something important changes. The mind is no longer pulled as strongly toward what it wants to keep, or pushed as forcefully away from what it fears to lose. Experience becomes less directional, fullgoda. This does not mean the mind becomes blank or detached. Seda, it becomes balanced. In Buddhist understanding, this balance is not created by effort at the end of life. It emerges naturally when clinging has been weakened over time. Without strong pulling and pushing, awareness can rest more evenly within experience. When the mind is no longer dominated by preference, transitions feel less abrupt. Change is still present, but it does not arrive as an intrusion. It is recognized as part of a larger movement that has been unfolding all along. This is why Buddhism places such emphasis on equanimity, not as emotional neutrality, but as the ability to remain steady amid change. Equanimity does not deny feeling. It allows feeling without being carried away by it. As dying progresses, familiar reference points continue to fall away. The body's signals shift. The sense of orientation changes. For a mind accustomed to being pulled by attachment, this can feel disorienting. For a mind that has learned to rest without grasping, it feels more like a gentle release. From this perspective, the transition is not driven by will. It is shaped by conditions. When grasping is strong, movement is turbulent. When grasping has softened, movement is smoother. This understanding reframes what it means to die well. It is not about control, success, or achieving a particular state. It is about allowing experience to unfold without interference. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be completed perfectly. The mind simply follows the path it has been preparing all along. In the next section, we'll bring this chapter to a close by looking at how Buddhism understands the final letting go not as a dramatic moment, but as the natural conclusion of a process already familiar. In Buddhist understanding, the final letting go is not a dramatic act. It is not something the mind does intentionally. It is something that happens when holding on is no longer possible. By this point, much has already fallen away. Control has loosened. Familiar reference points have dissolved. What remains is a movement toward release, not chosen, not resisted, simply allowed. This is why Buddhism does not describe the end as a struggle between staying and leaving. It is described as a completion, a process reaching its natural conclusion when the conditions that sustained it can no longer do so. Fear arises when the mind imagines this moment as a loss it must endure. But when the mind has learned, over a lifetime, that release does not equal danger, this final transition is not experienced as an attack. There may still be uncertainty. There may still be change, but panic is not inevitable. From a Buddhist perspective, nothing essential is being torn away. There is no fixed core that must be defended. There is only a process completing itself, just as it has been doing in smaller ways all along. This is why preparation matters. Not to control the ending, but to make release familiar. When release has been practiced many times in daily life, in loss, in letting go, the final letting go is not foreign. It is recognized. This recognition does not require belief. It does not require understanding. It arises naturally when the mind is no longer fighting impermanence. The final letting go, then, is not something to fear in advance. It is simply the last moment of a pattern already lived, meeting what arises and allowing it to pass. With this, we complete the exploration of dying itself. We have looked at the process, the role of mind, attachment, and release. What remains now is to look beyond the moment of death, not to speculate, but to understand how Buddhism speaks about what continues without returning to the idea of a self. That is where the next chapter begins. After the moment of death, the question most people return to is simple: what continues? If there is no permanent self, no soul traveling intact, what carries forward? Buddhism answers this carefully, not with images or promises, but with a principle that has appeared throughout everything we've explored so far: continuity through conditions. What continues is not identity, it is momentum. Every intention, every habit, every tendency leaves a trace, not as a possession, but as a direction. Just as a thought influences the next thought, and a mood shapes perception, patterns move forward, even when a particular configuration dissolves. This is not unique to death. It is already visible in life. Notice how certain reactions arise before you decide, how familiar emotional tones appear without being invited, how tendencies repeat even when circumstances change. This is continuity without a center. In Buddhist understanding, death does not interrupt this movement. It interrupts a form. The pattern does not belong to a person. It belongs to conditions. This is why Buddhism avoids saying you go somewhere. There is no fix-it you to go. There is only movement shaped by what has been cultivated, reinforced, and repeated. This perspective is often misunderstood as cold or impersonal. But it is precisely this impersonality that removes fear. If nothing personal is being dragged forward, nothing personal needs to be defended. What continues is lawful, understandable, influenced by causes rather than fate. This understanding shifts attention back to the present. If momentum is what continues, then how we live now matters, not because it secures a future self, but because it shapes the quality of what unfolds. In the next section, we'll explore how Buddhism understands this continuity in relation to karma, not as reward or punishment, but as direction and tendency. Karma is often misunderstood because it is framed through moral language. Reward, punishment, good outcomes, bad outcomes. From a Buddhist perspective, this framing misses the essential point. Karma is not a system of judgment. It is a description of direction. Every intention inclines the mind in a certain way. Every repeated action strengthens a tendency. Over time, these tendencies form a momentum that shapes how experience unfolds.
Not because anyone decides it should, but because causes naturally lead to effects. This is easy to see in ordinary life. If anger is repeatedly indulged, it becomes quicker to arise. If attention is repeatedly scattered, clarity becomes harder to access. If patience is practiced, the mind settles more easily. None of this requires belief.
It is observable. Buddhism applies this same understanding to death. What continues is not a moral score. It is a trajectory. The mind does not arrive at the end of life as a blank slate. It carries habits of attention, emotional tone, and responsiveness that have been reinforced again and again. This is why Buddhism places such importance on intention. Not because intention determines worth, but because it determines direction. Intention is where momentum begins. From this view, karma is not fate. It is not a fixed destiny unfolding beyond influence. It is dynamic.
It shifts as conditions shift. New patterns can be cultivated. Old patterns can weaken. This understanding removes fear in a subtle way. There is no final reckoning to dread. There is only continuity, shaped by what has already been lived. At the same time, it introduces responsibility, not moral pressure, but clarity.
How we relate to experience matters because it leaves traces. Not forever, but long enough to shape what comes next. In Buddhism, this responsibility is empowering. It brings attention back to where influence actually exists, not in predicting the future, but in meeting the present with care. As we continue, we'll look at how this momentum is described after death, not in terms of location or destination, but as transition shaped by the same principles already at work. When people ask what happens after death, they often imagine a destination. Somewhere the mind goes. Somewhere experience resumes.
Buddhism deliberately avoids framing continuity this way. There is no emphasis on location, no focus on arriving, no language of travel. Instead, the emphasis remains on process. From a Buddhist perspective, continuity does not require a place to land. It unfolds through conditions reorganizing themselves. Just as a thought gives rise to another thought without moving anywhere, patterns continue without needing a container. This is difficult for the mind to accept because the mind is spatial. It wants to picture something. It wants an image of after. Buddhism resists this impulse, not to be evasive, but to remain accurate to experience. Whenever we look closely, experience does not occur in places. It occurs in moments. One moment conditions the next. Continuity happens through sequence, not location, applied to death. This means that what continues is not something that goes somewhere else. It is something that unfolds differently. The same momentum, now expressed under new conditions. This view removes a great deal of unnecessary fear. If there is no destination to reach, there is no risk of being sent somewhere. If there is no arrival, there is no failure to arrive correctly. What unfolds does so lawfully, shaped by tendencies, influenced by momentum, not judged, not assigned. This is why Buddhism is careful with imagery about the afterlife. Images easily become objects of attachment. They encourage the mind to project identity forward.
And projection reintroduces fear. Instead, Buddhism stays close to what can be known. Change, sequence, causality. These are already visible in life. Death does not interrupt them. It expresses them. As this understanding settles, the question, where do we go, begins to dissolve. It is replaced by a quieter question. How does experience continue when conditions shift? And that question does not require speculation. It invites observation. In the next section, we'll look at why Buddhism often remains intentionally silent about specifics and how that silence serves understanding rather than limiting it. One of the most striking things about Buddhist teachings on death is how much they leave unsaid. There are no detailed maps of what happens next, no timelines, no descriptions meant to satisfy curiosity. This silence is intentional. Buddhism recognizes that the mind does not simply want information. It wants reassurance. It wants certainty. And when certainty is offered too easily, it becomes something to cling to. Clinging is precisely what Buddhism is trying to loosen. When detailed descriptions of the afterlife are given, the mind immediately turns them into identity. This is what will happen to me. Expectations form. Preferences arise. Fear follows close behind. The teaching meant to reduce anxiety ends up reinforcing it. By leaving details open, Buddhism protects the practitioner from premature conclusions. It keeps attention grounded in what can actually be known, the patterns of experience unfolding right now. This approach also reflects intellectual honesty. The moment after death is not directly observable in the same way daily experience is. Rather than fill that gap with speculation, Buddhism chooses restraint. Silence, in this context, is not ignorance. It is discipline. It disciplines the mind away from projection and back toward awareness. Instead of imagining futures, attention is drawn to present conditions. Instead of rehearsing stories, the mind learns to stay with what is. This restraint serves another purpose. It keeps the teachings relevant regardless of belief. Whether someone accepts rebirth literally, metaphorically, or remains undecided, the practical implications remain the same. How the mind is trained now shapes how experience unfolds later. In this way, Buddhist silence is inclusive. It does not demand agreement. It invites observation. As this perspective settles, the need to know specifics about what comes after begins to loosen. Not because the question has been answered, but because the urgency behind it fades. What matters becomes clearer, not where experience goes, but how it moves. Not what will happen, but how we are relating to what is happening now. In the next section, we'll bring this chapter to a close by looking at how this open-ended understanding affects the way fear, hope, and curiosity are held in balance. When questions about what continues are no longer forced into answers, the emotional landscape begins to change. Fear does not disappear, but it no longer dominates. Hope remains, but it is no longer desperate. Curiosity stays present, but it is not restless. From a Buddhist perspective, this balance is important. Fear arises when uncertainty feels threatening. Hope arises when uncertainty is replaced with promise. Curiosity arises when uncertainty is allowed to remain open. Of these three, curiosity is the most stable. It does not demand resolution. It invites attention. Buddhism does not try to eliminate fear by offering hope. It does not try to suppress curiosity by offering certainty. Instead, it allows all three to exist, while gently shifting the center of gravity toward curiosity. When curiosity leads, the mind stops bracing. It stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios. It stops clinging to comforting images. It becomes interested in how experience unfolds rather than what it must guarantee. This shift has a quiet effect. Fear loses its urgency because it is no longer being resisted. Hope softens because it is no longer required to secure meaning. Curiosity becomes spacious, patient, and grounded. In this space, the question of what continues after death no longer needs a definitive answer. It becomes part of a larger inquiry into how experience moves, changes, and reorganizes itself. This is not indifference. It is engagement without fixation. From this vantage point, death is no longer the central problem to solve. It becomes one expression of a broader reality that experience is always in transition, always conditioned, always unfolding according to causes. With this understanding, the mind can rest, not because it knows what will happen, but because it no longer needs to know in order to be at ease. This completes the arc of continuity. We have looked at what moves forward without a self, how karma shapes direction rather than judgment, and why Buddhism remains intentionally open-ended about specifics alone. With this foundation in place, we are ready to move into the final phase of the journey, not toward answers, but toward integration. How all of this comes together in the way we live, relate, and meet the mystery of existence with steadiness. That is where the final chapter begins. By this point, something important may have shifted. Death is no longer standing at the center of attention, not because it has been solved, but because it no longer needs to be. When fear loosens, death stops organizing life from the background. Decisions are no longer driven primarily by avoidance. Time is no longer treated as something constantly slipping away. The mind stops bracing for an ending that has not yet arrived. From a Buddhist perspective, this is not denial. It is clarity. When death is no longer treated as the defining problem, life becomes more available. Attention returns to what is here, rather than what might be lost. Experience is met directly, without being filtered through anxiety about its impermanence. This does not make impermanence disappear. It changes how it is held. Instead of being a threat, impermanence becomes a condition.
Something neutral. Something already woven into every moment. And when it is seen this way, urgency begins to soften. We no longer rush through experiences as if they must justify themselves before ending. We no longer cling as tightly, because clinging is no longer mistaken for care. We begin to recognize that presence does not require permanence.
This shift has practical consequences. Relationships are listened to more carefully. Ordinary moments are treated with more respect. Not because they will last, but because they will not. From this view, meaning is no longer something to secure before time runs out. It is something that appears naturally when attention is no longer divided between now and later. In Buddhism, this is considered a mature relationship with death. Not fascination, not avoidance, simply balance. Death is acknowledged without being rehearsed. Life is lived without being postponed. As we continue, we'll look at how this balance reshapes the way we meet uncertainty itself, not only around death, but around everything that cannot be controlled. When death is no longer the central threat, uncertainty begins to look different. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer feels like something that must be conquered or resolved. Much of our anxiety comes from the belief that uncertainty is a flaw in reality, something temporary that should eventually be replaced by clarity. Buddhism challenges this belief gently. It suggests that uncertainty is not a problem to fix, but a condition to understand. When we stop demanding guarantees, the mind relaxes its grip. It no longer needs to predict every outcome to feel safe. This does not make us passive. It makes us responsive. Living with uncertainty in this way changes how we relate to decisions. We act without insisting on certainty. We care without needing assurance. We commit without demanding permanence. Life becomes less brittle. From a Buddhist perspective, this is a form of wisdom.
Not knowing, when held calmly, becomes a source of flexibility. The mind learns to adjust as conditions change, rather than breaking when expectations are not met. This flexibility is essential near the end of life, but it is just as valuable now. Every transition we face, change in health, relationship, role, or direction, carries uncertainty. When uncertainty is met with steadiness, fear has less room to grow. This steadiness does not come from belief. It comes from familiarity. Familiarity with change. Familiarity with letting go. Familiarity with the fact that experience continues even when certainty does not. As this familiarity deepens, uncertainty loses its emotional charge. It becomes part of the landscape rather than an obstacle in the way. The mind stops bracing and starts listening. In this way, understanding death reshapes how we live long before death arrives. It teaches us how to remain present when outcomes are unclear, how to stay engaged without needing control, and how to meet life as it unfolds rather than as we wish it to be. In the final section, we'll bring everything together not by summarizing ideas, but by allowing the reflections to settle into a single, quiet orientation toward life and death. At the end of this reflection, there may be a sense that nothing dramatic has been resolved. No final answer has been given. No certainty has been secured. And that is intentional. From a Buddhist perspective, clarity does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a shift in orientation, a different way of standing in relation to life and death without needing to control either. Death has not been explained away. It has not been transformed into something comforting or reassuring. It has simply been placed back into its proper context as part of the same movement that shapes every moment of experience. When this is seen clearly, something softens, not because the unknown disappears, but because the mind no longer needs it to. Life is no longer lived in preparation for an ending. Death is no longer held as a problem waiting to be solved. What remains is attention. Attention to what is here. Attention to what is changing. Attention to what is being held and what is ready to be released. This attention does not demand belief. It does not require agreement. It only asks for honesty, and honesty about impermanence, about uncertainty, and about the absence of anything solid to cling to. From this place, fear no longer organizes experience. It may still arise in, but it no longer commands. Hope may still appear, but it no longer needs to promise permanence. Curiosity remains, steady and open, allowing experience to unfold without rushing it toward meaning. This is not a special state. It is a simple one. Living with care, letting moments complete, meeting change without adding resistance. In this way, death is no longer something separate from life. It is no longer an interruption waiting at the end. It is part of the same rhythm that has been present all along, arising, passing, and making space for what comes next. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing needs to be taken away. What matters now is not what happens after this reflection ends, but how attention returns to ordinary life, how listening continues, then how presence shows up in small, unremarkable moments. That is where this understanding lives, quietly,
without announcement, one moment at a time.